looking at the biodiversity, what the development happens, and then making sure that any biodiversity that was on the site is replaced somewhere, if not on the site. So that led to what we call the no net loss policy. So that was just literally just biodiversity offsets. And then with the 25-year environment plan, the government said what we need to do is actually sort of make sure that we can try and regain some of the loss from previous development as well. So now developers have to look at the biodiversity on the site that they're going to develop. They submit their plans, and what they need to make sure then is that as well as the biodiversity that's built back into the development, they also have to get 10% better or more biodiversity than was on the original land. And that can be delivered on site or off site. So that's why we call this one net gain. So when a developer is putting their plans together for a piece of land, they've got to go through what we call the mitigation hierarchy. So first of all, they've got to avoid destroying biodiversity as much as possible in their design. So if the features on the site, try and sort of create and build around those. Next bit is to mitigate on site as much as possible any damage that might happen. So trying to minimize that loss. And then ultimately, when they've done that, it's only then can they actually look for off-site compensation. And so the idea is this is not going to be a license to trash. It should be a way to actually try and make developments better, much more sort of sympathetic to the residents that move into the place, and make them better places to live in effectively, which then reduces costs for health, and you got the other ecosystem services that come off from that. So they have to go through that mitigation hierarchy. You got your hand up, Don? You all right?
Yeah, no, so, yeah, I'm fine. No, just a point of clarification. So when you say development, are we talking about all house building, residential stuff, and commercial premises? Does it include everything?
Yes, it does. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's everything. So anything you want to build or anything, house or
yeah.
barn conversion, anything like that, this applies. Okay.
Yeah. So these principles apply to all scales of development, though they haven't sorted out an easy metric for the small scale developments, like 3-5 homes or whatever, because of the amount of land taken, the transaction cost could be too expensive. So they're trying to make an easy way to make that happen for small homes. So it would be probably like a fixed fee transaction for that kind of thing. But all depends on the developers as they go through if there's bats on site, for example, you still have to look after the legally protected species first, and then you build that into the whole equation as you move through. As I said, so the process on site is the developer measures the biodiversity on site as it is now, and DEFRA have developed a calculator that has gone through its various iterations on version 4 now, and that looks at various characteristics of the different habitats on site. And then so they apply their design and say, well, if we build it this way, what is the loss we expect from the biodiversity on the site? So if they had, say, a hectare of grassland on the site and they're building over 70% of that, but keeping 30%, then you can say, well, 70% of the biodiversity has been lost. And so if that measurement on the site said there was that equivalent of 1 hectare of grassland was 3 biodiversity units, at the end of the scheme, they would have to find 3.3 units. So if they only kept 30% on site, that's 1 unit. So that means they have to go to find 2.3 units elsewhere. Is that okay? Does my maths sound okay to you guys on that one? So when it comes to then looking at the same principles off-site and coming onto the farm now, so normally it's the farmer will offer saying, well, I'm interested in doing this, enhancing this kind of grassland or changing this from arable to grassland or planting woodland or whatever. And just saying, this is what I'm prepared to do on the site. So again, we do that survey of the biodiversity on the site, put that into the metric calculator, which says This is the size of the land that's been offered. This is the quality of habitat that is there now, and these are the habitats to be there in the future. And so the difference between the before and after is the amount of uplift in biodiversity. So you're being paid for the change in biodiversity, not for the kind of the full thing at the end. It's the difference between the starting point and the end point is really what is paid for. So if you apply sort of quite simply, then if you wanted to get the maximum biodiversity for an area, if the land was virtually a green desert or devoid of biodiversity, and then you created a superb culm grassland or herb-rich meadow or a woodland or a wetland, then you've actually sort of maximized that difference between the starting point and the end point. If you've already got good habitats, you can enhance those and enhance the quality of them, but the uplift may not be so high. But there's quite a lot of different factors in the equation that goes into the calculator, which is a spreadsheet, and sometimes it gives some surprising outcomes. So what normally happens is as I said, we work with both the developer and the landowner and say, well, you know, on the net gain calculations, make sure it's been done right. We check those out. The developer comes to us quite often these days and says, developing 50 homes here, but the planning authority tell me I need to find some biodiversity credits. So we look at what they're developing on. Are there any habitats that need to be replaced like for like? So if they're priority habitats, for example, they would have to be replaced. If it was culm grassland, they'd have to replace with culm grassland. If it's woodland, they'd have to replace with woodland. But if they're just building on improved pasture or semi-improved pasture, then you can actually sort of move between habitats. It doesn't have to be improved pasture again. It would be something else that's much better. So you trade up in the different habitats in their distinctiveness. So we try and then sort of match the landowner and the developer with the kind of credits that they need for the moment. And we inform the planning officer saying, right, yeah, we've got something that's going to work. The price of it is agreed between the landowner and the developer. And then we build those cost estimates into a legal agreement in the Section 106 agreement for planning. And then that becomes the transaction. So when the planning permission is granted and the developer starts work, they have to move that money over so that we can then pay you as the farmer to actually sort of get on and do the work. So our role as the biodiversity reserve is to be this sort of broker in the middle that makes sure that things are happening in a fair way, and you get the money you need as you do the works, and then once the project is started, those credits are then registered against the land, and they have to sort of be there for the next 30 years. So we've got a natural capital marketplace that we developed, which helps to facilitate that. So if you wanted to sort of log onto the marketplace, it's got a couple of glitches at the moment, we're just trying to sort out. So don't go straight to it yet. But essentially on that, you put in your ideas of what you want to do, and then we can then help you develop the Biodiversity Net Gain offer. And then at the other end of the marketplace, we've got developers coming in saying, I need X amount of credits of this type, and then we can sort of use this as almost like a dating agency to link the farmers with the landowners and produce make the transactions work. I mean, ultimately, what we could have is that as a landowner, you could be producing lots of different biodiversity credits, and they just go on the shelf ready to sell, and then the people sort of buy them as they're ready. So you can name your own price on there, and if the developer says yes, that's good value to me, I'll buy them at those price, then it works as a market that way, and we can then sort of facilitate that trade. But I think I've done this one, haven't I? Yeah, so on the supply side, with sort of making those biodiversity credits, as I said, we work through and check through all that, and then we sort of advertise those on the website using the marketplace. So when it comes to sort of buying from those, this is how the marketplace works. The developer makes a request for credits, and there's a calculation within that spreadsheet that says it's got to be spatially appropriate. So most people say, well, it should be as close as possible to the development site. That isn't always possible. So it has to be at least within the local plan authority, the local planning authority area. So if it's in North Devon, it has to be somewhere within North Devon district. If it's within Torridge, it has to be within Torridge district. If you go outside of the district, then there's a kind of penalty incurred because they're saying, well, spatially that's too far from the development proposal, and therefore it's not going to be as good because you're losing biodiversity in a certain area. So they say you get half the value with the credits. So it pays to sort of work with developers inside the local planning authority area that you're in. So the developer buys those credits. It's a 30-year agreement. I'll explain how we sort of structure that. And we sort of take the money, we hold it there for safekeeping. It goes into our defined purposes fund or an escrow account, which means that it's safe there as a charity. Nobody else can get their hands on it. And then it comes out to you as and when it's sort of agreed in the schedule of payments. And as I say, the credits, the biodiversity credits, are registered now on the national register, and they're sort of set and lodged against that sort of deed on the property. Doesn't go into the title deeds. It's just registered there on this. It's a bit like a land use charges register that gets recorded there, so that it means that you can't sell the biodiversity for the same piece of land twice. Someone's got a hand up. Who's that? Oh, it's done.
It's me again, I'm afraid.
That's all right, Don. Yeah.
You're okay to ask questions as we go along?
Yeah, sure.
So to bring that to life then, so there's a development just outside Witheridge, not to get into any private stuff or anything like that, but landers, they're extending the estate there, so obviously it's horse pasture land, it's now being built on. So in that regard then, how does the developer, because obviously that land now is going to be tarmacked and built on, etc. Gone on it. There's no diversity going on there. So they just go and get credits elsewhere, or what does the farm? The person who sold the land, how does that work with them? Who's buying the credits, and what does the developer? Just a real example.
That's a real good question. Who buys the credits? And it's and normally it's the person buying the homes buys the credits. So the farmer sold the land and said, well, there's the land, here's the land with planning permission or whatever. This is what needs to be done. It might be outlined planning consent. So it's at the detailed planning consent stage that the biodiversity credits have to be in place for it to proceed. That's going to be the law as of November. So in your case there, the landowner sold the land and says, there you go, take your chances kind of thing, as it were. But anybody now buying land would need to look very carefully at the land that they are buying, because if it has got lots of biodiversity on it and they want to develop it, it's going to cost them more to develop that land than it would be if it was an improved meadow, for example. So it's the developer then that says, right, here's the biodiversity calculation. This is how we do our design. This is how we mitigated it, through avoid, mitigate, ultimately compensate, and this is what we need. So in your case there, on the edge of Witheridge, ideally the developer would be looking at sites close by, because the closer it is, the better it is for that spatial thing. But it doesn't improve any as long as it's within the same district. And ironically, at Witheridge, if it went across the border into Mid Devon, which is probably as close as anywhere it could be, it still gets penalised for that distance, for that just being in a different planning authority area, even though geographically it may be closer. So that's part of the irony of it. So you could have that developer developing on that land at Witheridge, but he's bought his biodiversity credits over at Braunton, right at the other end of the district, when there could have been a farm just across the border in Mid Devon, much closer with the same kind of habitat. But that's one of the vagaries of the scheme that we're just trying to. The reason they put that in is because imagine what it's like in the southeast of England, where it's all really crowded. They would say, well, biodiversity might be cheaper in Devon, So you're ultimately sort of depleting all the biodiversity in the southeast and enhancing it all in the southwest, and it doesn't make any kind of sense as a scheme for making sort of getting people close to nature, which is what the whole strategy was about in the first place.
Yeah. So just one point there. So is it not you're not incentivizing a landowner to say, well, let's. I assume that everyone on this call is all doing biodiversity, whatever degree, etc., and old meadow and the rest of it. So we're doing that. But if you were another type of landowner, just say, well, just keep mine as ryegrass, that green desert, and actually the developer's going to pay me more for that because he's got less remedial costs, isn't it? Because I don't have to replace it.
No, you're right. I mean, that's the whole perversity of the scheme. I was saying to the guy, should I do this in the manner of Jonathan Pye ranting report on it? And you're quite right. This is, again, all of these things seem to work in favour of the person who's done bad over the years.
Mm.
So like you say, the farmer with just a ryegrass field is going to get more value for his land because it doesn't have the biodiversity risks on it. And likewise, on the other side of the equation, the farmer that has ryegrass has more to gain from the biodiversity on his land than somebody who's already enhanced their land because of the payment of change. And it stinks, I think, because how do you reward people for doing good historically when it's the ones who've done bad. So you could say, well, it's the philosophy of changing somebody from bad to good is probably more beneficial in the long run. But that's that. I can see how that feels unfair for those landowners like yourselves who are actually sort of doing good in the first place. Yeah.
Could I ask a question just from one of your previous comments?
Yeah, sure.
Planning in North Devon, it's obviously done by North Devon District Council. Are you picking up developments from that? And how small do you go down to in this scheme?
Yeah, it's at the moment the developers are coming to us directly because the planning officer says you need to look at biodiversity net gain because the planning authorities here in North Devon and Torridge were ahead of the game for the last few years, and they're saying, we're going to apply this biodiversity policy, therefore, get used to it and get into it. So they've always been sort of pushing people in our direction. As you say, that the very small developments, like the 5 homes kind of scale, is they're probably taking quite a small area with that kind of level of development. And it's quite expensive to actually go through this whole rigmarole of measuring the biodiversity and the design, etc. And for that kind of scale, it would be much simpler if there was a straightforward flat rate payment of, say, £1,000 per home that went into a biodiversity pot that we could then use to develop projects that would then enhance biodiversity according to a set of plans that we have. So, but from November onwards, the scheme becomes mandatory nationally, and therefore all development has to go through this, but they still haven't really formulated a solution for those very small developments. So at the moment, it's a little bit like finger in the wind, to be honest.
I only ask from a bit of a selfish point of view, and I'm putting a 250 square metre barn up for weddings on the farm.
Oh yeah,
which is being cleared of, as Don put, green desert or ryegrass. So we're clearing that area.
Yeah.
But I just wondered if after November that sort of development would come under that.
It probably would. Like I say, we're coming to the small scale one, and I think the cost on that kind of one would be quite moderate. I wouldn't want to say what they are at the moment. They're still trying to figure it out. But for that kind of, say, the small ideas there, the small developments, if it was, say, £1,000 per home or whatever. It might be different for a barn with it being sort of 250 square meters. It might be equivalent of three homes, for example, so maybe £3,000. We're going to a program fund where we would deliver improvements in green infrastructure or other projects, so we'd actually sort of mass things together and do a much bigger project somewhere else that accounts for the loss of biodiversity from all those small developments. And let's face it, North Devon and Torridge historically, about 70% of the applications have been on these small scale developments. It's only sort of relatively recent around sort of Barnstable and Bideford where there've been sort of much larger scale developments going in. So they need to develop something, in my mind, very quickly for those small areas. Otherwise, development will be happening that isn't being accounted for.
Thank you for that.
Okay. Just did I cover that properly? So when you go through the calculation, it says, does all this fit with the strategy? Well, we've got lots of strategies, as you might imagine, across the whole area for where biodiversity be good to develop, so to guide us on what kind of habitats and where. Oh, Jill, you got your hand up, sorry.
Oh, so it was just a quick question. You were talking about from November.
Yeah.
I wasn't quite sure whether that was new applications from November. In other words, to what extent are existing kind of developments which are going through the planning process currently, to what extent they're already included or not?
Yeah, it'll be compulsory for all applications starting in November. So if somebody's already got their application in now and it's still been sort of decided on, it's still under the, if you like, North Devon's policy or Torridge District's policy. So it's not nationally mandatory, but the district council have been very much trying to lead and sort of get developers to do the biodiversity net gain. So it's there. That's why we're sort of moving these things through. And it's been a very sort of strange time because you've got some of these developers that bought land a while ago and they bought it at quite a high price. And it may have land that has a lot of biodiversity on it, in which case now they've got to sort that out, and that's going to cost them more. And because it's just a local policy, when it comes down to it, they'll say, well, yeah, I could do biodiversity net gain, but you want me to pay for affordable homes and you want me to pay for road junctions and you want me to pay for this. And the risk is at the moment is that they'll claim affordability issues.
Yeah.
And say, well, we can't do that. So what are you going to drop, the affordable homes or the biodiversity? And there always is that risk that the local authority is going to say, okay, we'll have to forego the biodiversity or the or one of the other features, but they can't get everything. So that makes it quite a tough call. But certainly what we're trying to do is make it as easy as possible. But as soon as it becomes mandatory, the price, because it will be required by law, the price is going to go up for biodiversity credits. And we try to keep it at a level that is affordable by the landowner and affordable by the developer, and trying to meet that middle ground. But certainly, as soon as it becomes mandatory, then in terms of that, well, you can't get the development without having the credits. And that's going to make a different change in the market. Like I say, it's going to affect the land values in the first place. So something that's got lots of biodiversity on is going to be really expensive to develop, so developers won't be touching it. The land that is just the ryegrass will probably become more valuable in terms of development because it's going to be easier to secure the development on it. I think that because of the certain costs involved, there'll be some developers or organisations that'll do their own land banking. We know there's a few developers around been looking at that, buying bits of land so they can then do their own biodiversity credits there, get them verified and validated and say, there you go, I've got my credits, I don't need to buy from anybody else. And it certainly is going to sort of change some of those markets quite a lot, is how we see it working.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting, complicated.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. I was hoping not to make it too complicated, but you're quite right, it is complex. So when we come to looking at the kind of options we have to do on land, we've got, as I say, those different strategies, and one of the best one being is the nature recovery plan that we developed, which is again sort of ahead of the game nationally, but each county has to deliver a local nature recovery strategy, which will look at very much as we have done on which habitats and where are going to be the most favourable to do. So if it meets and sort of those geographic targets within the strategy, then again it gets more points in terms of the number of credits you can get from that piece of land. Here's an example of, it's a real example, as Don says, to bring it to life. So this is a farm over near Bideford where some people have bought the land. There was a tenant on the land, and they've been working with the tenant. And what they said was, well, what we want to do here is sort of help it sort of make its way with biodiversity net gain. So it's not a massive farm. The coastal fringe is there, the shoreline, and here there's National Trust have this small area here, which is coastal grassland. So what they're doing is they're moving the fence line back and trying to create more coastal grassland there, because as the cliff erodes, that thin strip of coastal grassland gets squeezed out. So they're saying, well, they'll allow it to expand inland there. Up in these fields here, they're looking to do more herb-rich meadows. So there'll be kind of a transition from coastal grassland to herb-rich meadows in these areas. There was a bit of woodland there that was planted, which didn't do too well, so they're enhancing that woodland. Down through here, there was the stream was actually put into a culverted pipe all the way through. So what they've done there is they've broken that pipe up and created small ponds and overspills. So they've actually got a wetland area that goes all the way down through the farm in that area, down to this bottom area here. And then around this outer hedge, they're expanding the hedge, so creating more habitat there. So it's hedgerow expansion stroke woodland, with again a bit of a rough grassland fringe on the outside of that. So there's a gradation from the grassland that the tenant is still going to keep and graze, through to more rank grasslands, through to the hedge, to the woodland and hedgerow. And then in this field here, this is one where they're going to put some parkland type planting in, so it's more like wood pasture, and then a bit more kind of denser woodland in here with pasture in the middle. That again is going to just add more interest to the area. It's quite a challenge because it's right next to the coast, so growing trees in that environment is pretty tough. But we've been looking at the species, making sure they're quite suitable and climate resilient, and make sure we're going to have a sort of good level of success. So we've done the biodiversity calculations on all the land there. So there's developments going on in Bideford, and as they're coming online, and the developers are saying, have you got any biodiversity units we could buy? We can go straight to this farm and say, right, we're ready to do this field now, and start kicking off those credits. And we then have a 30-year agreement for that piece of land that then sets out what the capital costs are for the conversion and what the annual payment will be going forward from that. Any questions on that one?
Yeah, I have. So just for clarity again, so are you saying then, so at the moment we're in mid-tier, so it's shit film. So we just have, I think somebody else said we're in that, so it's basically don't cut the grass before the 1st of July, cut your grass, and then you have a bit of few sheep during the winter, and that's it, and grow your hedges. Now, if we haven't done is left a big border at the end. And we're just considering should we do that. Now, are you saying if you do a program like that, leaving the border, does that mean we can then apply to get credits? I mean, are we missing out there? I don't know.
Yeah, no, there's a it depends. I'll come to the it depends slide in a minute.
Okay, all right.
But it's a good question to ask. You're quite right. So this is where we kind of try to calculate and split the costs, where we look at what's the capital cost of doing the work. So with that particular farm, we're looking at making the herb-rich meadows and looking at various options for it. You could either, if you're going to do it sort of big scale, you would say, right, okay, we got to strip off the topsoil. You're going to dispose of the topsoil somewhere else, and you go subsoil, which is low fertility. Then you reseed that, and that's a hugely expensive way of doing it. The other end of the scale is using green hay technique. So where you guys are, that would probably be an easy thing for you to do, because what you do is you take your grass down to its lowest possible level, you scarify it a bit, you take a green hay cut from land nearby, and then you scatter that hay across your land with the seed that's in it. Use the stock to kind of munch it in, trample it in a bit, and then take off the hay, and then you got your seed there to germinate, start creating your meadow. It takes a little bit longer to do it that way, because you might have to do that a few times to get the full seed mix in there, but that's quite an easy way to do it. The way that we're going to do it on that farm back on the coast is there's no good land nearby that we can take the green hay from. And so what we're doing there is putting a power harrow across the site, across the field, and then introducing seed and scattering that into the power harrowed area, and then start managing from a grassland from that. So you're reseeding it, but you've got a much more herb-rich mix in the seed going into it. So there's different horses for courses and how you actually do these things. So when it comes to the cost, we're trying to work out what those capital costs would be, and we've got to look at what are the costs over the 30 years and link those to inflation. These days, it's hard to say what is the inflation figure we use. I don't, we could sort of say 10%, but it'd be a hard call to say it's going to be sort of 2.5%, 3%, which the Treasury want. It's going to have to be something a little more realistic to make sure that nobody loses out. And and those costs include the annual operation costs, so what it costs for you to maintain the habitat, and also the cost to you is the income foregone. So if you were continuing to graze that under a conventional system with a slightly higher stocking rate, then there is a difference in the income that you would have expected. So that is also compensated within the scheme. And the other payment the landowner gets is, because all of the above, they're basically covering the costs and making it cost neutral against what you would have done normally. So there has to be a premium that comes in on top of that, which makes it more of an incentive for the landowner to change that practice and do something better for biodiversity. So in theory, and it should be in practice, that moving to a biodiversity net gain will be more profitable than your current business as usual. And from our side, the foundation side, we'll help with the surveys and the transaction costs, the legal costs. We've got to sort of do that checking for the credits over the 30-year period and help to make sure that the management plan's implemented, and also have a buffer for some contingency for what might go wrong. So it's about sharing the risks there between the landowner and ourselves, as to, if you've planted a load of trees and a new disease comes in, that's like a force majeure. But if you'd planted the trees and then your cattle had got in, then there's a kind of, wasn't the fencing right, etc. So you need to sort of kind of broker out how what was the cause, who's liable, and how we fix those problems. And we try to sort of mitigate that as much as possible. Some of the challenges we've had about the scheme so far is that not many landowners are willing, because locking into a 30-year agreement, that is really sort of saying you can't do anything different for your land for the next 30 years. Some of that's been particularly where a landowner's moving in towards retirement and got young people coming in behind them. They're saying, I don't want to lock the kids into a 30-year agreement. And we can see that, but on the other side of it, it's a 30-year guaranteed income, which maybe they wouldn't have had otherwise. Conservation covenants, that's a new thing that's been brought in, which helps to, just like any other restrictive covenant goes against the land, it gets lodged with the deeds for 30 years and said, this is how this land should be get. So if you sold the land, that goes along with the deed. So it means that whoever takes the land from you needs to have that commitment set against it. there's a lot of landowners saying, well, we're waiting to see what happens with the price, because like I said, November's coming up very soon. It's going to be a statutory market, in which case, the price may go up considerably. There will be something that sort of measures against that, because as the developers see the price go up as well, they will do whatever they can to maximize the biodiversity on site. And that might be realistic or unrealistic in terms of that. So that comes in the other bit. And it's volatile times for agriculture. Nobody can really see which way to go. We didn't predict the war in Ukraine and what that meant in terms of oilseed rape prices. So now we've got a lot more rape being planted in the countryside, just because there's a big demand for that, for the oil. And again, some landowners are saying, well, this land has to be publicly registered. So there's somebody saying, I don't want that. There's somebody, any member of the public, saying they can see what I have to do with my land. But there has to be something there that means that, as I say, the land can't be sold twice for biodiversity credits. It needs to be. I'm sure none of you would do that, but I bet there are people out there who would try to sell them twice. So and like I say, on the other side of the thing, where we have a challenge is those affordability claims by the developers, particularly between now and November, where they're saying, well, I can't really afford this, therefore you either have social housing or you have biodiversity. Make the choice. The other one is, as I said, they're trying to maximize their biodiversity on the development site itself, and sometimes that is good, but sometimes they make some incredible claims about it. And what we have to do is make sure that that's actually deliverable in the end of the day. And there's quite a few I've seen, or I'd say that would be a push to actually sort of guarantee that. And the other one is, getting the right habitats as close as possible. But what some of the planning committee members, don't really understand is it could be anywhere within the district, as I mentioned, from Witheridge to Braunton. It could be as far as that. Whereas there was some of the developments been working on in Torridge, the council were expecting it to be in the field next door, which isn't always feasible.
So just on that 30, I mean, it just seems to me there's a very clear red line, and that's the 30 years. I mean, who would sign up for 30 years? Because it's multi-generational, isn't it? I mean, you're yourself. I mean, by the end of that, well, I won't be here. So that's until with a sell it or whatever we do. I mean, I just don't see why anybody would with anything about them. So you go, 10 years see would be the max, because you can forecast 10 years better, but 30 years is just so unknown, isn't it?
It is, and I think you've just expressed there, how challenging it is for some landowners to get their head around it. From the, if you like, the rationale point of view is that those houses are going to be on that land forever, literally. In which case, you've got to make sure that at least you're approaching that forever equation, whatever that is. With the nutrient neutrality schemes, that's taking phosphates out of the system. They're looking for agreements there about 100 and 120 years in terms of the covenants they put in. So effectively, yeah, you're sterilizing that land and what it can be used for, and restricting those choices. But yeah, I sympathise and hear exactly what you're saying. 30 years does seem a long time. We've done 20-year agreements on intertidal habitats, and the landowners saw the benefit of that in terms of that guaranteed income. And we try to sort of, like I say, compensate that as well with being linked to inflation, or put an inflationary rise in it. But I think what your reaction is what we're seeing from a lot of other people as well. So I think it's going to be a really hard market to get going. Just things that, when it comes to your land and what works in the calculator, and how it works. So it treats hedges and watercourses differently from area-based land. So fields and hedges are treated differently. So you could have, so taking your scheme, if you haven't got anything under stewardship for your hedges, you could put the hedges under a linear biodiversity improvement. We don't see many linear credits being asked for. You can't mix the two. But there's a possibility there that you could, say just use your hedges for biodiversity net gain. When it comes to the areas of land, so the fields, for example, it's the habitat type that is important. So some of them are high priority habitats. If you've got, as you say, the rye grassland, that's what we call a modified grassland. That could be changed to anything. But if you've already got what is a priority habitat, all you can do is enhance that priority habitat. You can't change it to something else. So those habitat types have a distinctiveness score. So the more distinctive the habitat is that you have, or just as importantly, the distinctiveness of the habitat you want to create, that ups the level of the credits. So if you start with a low distinctive habitat and moving to a very distinctive habitat, you're starting on a winner there because you're trying to go for something that's got very high points attached to it. The next bit is habitat condition. So again, if you're starting with a habitat that is in poor condition, rye grassland, or if it's culm grassland is barely looking like culm grassland, just looking like a rushy meadow, then there's a habitat in poor condition, and then you want to move it to one that's in good condition. So again, it's that scale of movement that gives you the points. So that's the proposed habitat and its condition. The other thing the other thing that they score is the complexity risk. So how difficult is it to create that habitat or enhance that habitat? So enhancing a habitat is fairly easy. Creating a brand new habitat is quite technically difficult. And then, there are different scales within that. Planting woodland is, I'm a forester, so I'd say, well, that's great, that's easy, but it's not always easy for other people. So that's all taken into account. And also the time it takes to reach that habitat and condition is taken into the account in the equation. So woodlands get penalised because they say it takes more than 30 years to get to woodland. So that knocks the value down. If you can get a habitat that gets to its new condition quickly, that could be things like scrub or bramble scrub or whatever. That's quite an easy one to reach. But if you want to culm grassland, there's a little bit more sort of technical involvement in that. So they would say it's 10 years and that's scored accordingly. And then you've got these spatial and strategic factors. Does it fit within a strategy? Is it within the same planning authority area? And again, they're the factors that give you the points. So just saying on the right-hand side of the screen there, what works easiest? So enhancement is easier than creation. So just making it easier makes it much more achievable. It means you get more points because the risk is less. Quickly established habitats get more points, like say scrubland habitats, whatever, rather than woodland, which is a shame. That makes me rant, but I won't. And things that are cheaper to achieve over the lifetime are going to be in your favor again, because it's going to be a standard payment for credits, regardless of what they are. So whatever you can do cheaper for yourselves, that means there's more profit for yourself in delivering those credits. Okay, Nicola's got a hand up.
I was just going to ask on that point, I mean, not to be cynical about developers, but isn't there a kind of danger that we're just going to get less improved sort of habitats where we really want to be going for the more sort of enhanced habitats?
Yeah, I mean, it's about volume. So it's either you stack it high or you do it wide. And then anyone who's gone up for a habitat that's been enhanced from poor to moderate, once that's delivered, or if they've delivered better than that, then they've got more credits to sell beyond that. So the landowner can actually not sell the same credits, but they could use the same land again at the end of that 30 years and say, okay, I've delivered it to moderate. I can get it to good in a short time and then get the benefit of those credits from beyond that. Similarly, if we've been on the land, been monitoring the track of it, if over that period the landowner got it better than good, better than moderate, and got it to good condition, that elevation in the score there is more credits that we can then sell again for the landowner to benefit from. So there have been 3 credits for getting it to moderate, but actually he delivered 5 credits because he got it to good. So there's another 2 credits to sell on that same piece of land, and we can sort of validate and moderate that. But you're quite right. Developers are, may go for certain habitats because they're easy to do or cheaper to do, and that's where the open market might sort of, might make it a bit harder for us to actually achieve those good quality habitats. The example I give is that when we were setting up the first version of this, it was about sort of relative costs and this sort of thing. So that the landowner would say to the developer, I'll deliver your biodiversity for X amount. And if it was those cheap and easy habitats, the price would be low. But as we know down here in Barnstable and Bideford, where we're trying to enhance things around the estuary, it's very expensive to actually create new salt marsh. So it's about £50,000 compared to say £6,000 or £7,000 per hectare for the different habitats. In which case, which developer is going to buy a credit at £50,000? Kind of, they wouldn't. So you're quite right. There's a danger of the market just pushing for the easiest and cheapest, getting the easy stuff off the shelf, as it were. I didn't say it was a perfect scheme. And this is where, Don, your particular sort of question comes in about additionality. And so if you're already in a scheme, it's not a given that you can do biodiversity net gain on top of that scheme and get paid for it. But there are rules out now that say which ones you can do. So nutrient neutrality, which is literally about sort of stepping back and taking phosphates out of the system, you could apply biodiversity net gain on top of that without any particular problem. Sustainable farming incentives, if you're looking at soils, you certainly can add biodiversity net gain on top of that with the practice that you would do, because you're delivering biodiversity on top of what is expected for the soils. That's just one example, but there are other things like with the SFI and hedges. That's about getting the hedges back into good condition, etc., which is what biodiversity gain seeks to do. So you couldn't mix SFI and BNG in that case. With the woodland planting and the English woodland creation offer, you can only do that if there isn't the requirement from the developer to do like for like. So if the developer was knocking down a woodland and had to replace woodland, you wouldn't get biodiversity net gain on the planting that you did that was funded by UCO. If the developer was ruining or taking away improved pasture, ryegrass, and said they wanted to plant woodland, you could get that payment then and do biodiversity net gain for the woodland. Within UCO, there is a small top up for biodiversity improvement. If you go for biodiversity net gain, you just sign off that biodiversity improvement addition from the Forestry Commission and take the biodiversity net gain payment from the from the BNG element. Countryside stewardship is much more complex. So if you're getting your non-intensive or low-intensive grassland payment, it's just telling you to take cattle off the ground. But if you can then do some reseeding and enhancements after that, you could probably get a biodiversity net gain improvement on top of that. But if you're getting a stewardship payment that's telling you to create a certain habitat or paying you to create a certain habitat, that will not be eligible for mixing biodiversity net gain with that. So it's quite a complex thing. Then when it comes to looking at how we can sell other credits as well, so linking carbon credits to biodiversity credits, etc., there's another whole maze of stuff to get through on that one. I tried to sort of capture it there on the screen, which is if you go for woodland carbon code, they're saying no because there's a legal and finance test that needs to be passed. It gets linked to planning, and therefore they say you can't use biodiversity net gain and carbon code at the same time. It's either or. And likewise with peatland carbon code, but you can do more biodiversity on top of what you're doing for peatland code maybe it's about some of the species, for example, then it would actually add to that. So it all depends on what you're doing, and provided you're not getting paid for it already, it'll be okay. And as I mentioned, if countryside stewardship or elms or SFI is doing the same job, then it's you can't mix them at all. So timelines, to say winter 23, this November, this is when it all kicks in, and for all town and country planning applications, as Peter was asking there, that's when it all becomes mandatory. So we're trying to get all the systems set up within the district councils and ourselves to make sure we can deal with that volume. And so we've got our Biodiversity Net Gain natural capital marketplace set up, so it's just making sure that's again ready for action. And that's it. Everything we know about Biodiversity Net Gain, and a lot of questions I still leave asking myself. Hi, Jill.
Is there anywhere else in the world where a similar system to this is operating?
Yeah, it's been done in the States for a long time and Australia.
Right.
And they've been using all sorts of mechanisms, but they've gone really big for land banking.
Right.
And if I don't need the screen anymore, I'll stop sharing. He said. So yeah, that's where big NGOs have actually sort of bought lots of land in poor condition, enhanced it, and then sold those credits to the developers. Within Australia, it's been they set up these local catchment groups, and they've been using all the offsets to protect watercourses and buffer strips all around those watercourses, and using it there. And then on a less structured market, a lot of the mining industries have been sort of buying into it as well. So there was some stuff that I was tangentially involved with in West Africa, on Mount Nimba, the northern side of Ghana. So it's been around for a few years in different guises in different countries. I think it's only, and the principle of equivalence of this sort of biodiversity in a field of a certain size and type is equivalent to another one somewhere else. That's been used quite a lot in the States as well, and in Canada, particularly with oil and gas exploration, where they're sort of saying, well, these are the habitats and compensations you have to use.
So it sounds as if it's been done in those countries on quite a big scale and by bodies dealing with quite large amounts of land. Perhaps that's I may be wrong, but it sounds a little bit different in scale to what's being suggested here, dealing with individual farmers and so on.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, the difference in scale is the big thing, because I mentioned about I'm going to move off biodiversity for a second, but on carbon codes. So we've been looking at saying, well, how much carbon can we sequester in salt marshes, and is there a code and a methodology that standardizes that so we can sell them as verified? And there was a code that was developed over in the United States, but the cost of measuring to the degree of accuracy they want, it would cost us more to do those measurements than we'd actually get from the carbon benefits themselves. But if you do that on a massive scale, as they have done in the States and South America and the like, it kind of makes sense, because it's the numbers of measurements, the intensity of measurements that sort of really makes it unaffordable. But if you do it on a really big scale, it is far more affordable, and you've got much more carbon being stored, and it works that way. So the challenge, as you say, in the UK is actually doing it on a scale at which we operate in the UK, which is never at sort of huge scales anyway. And that's what makes it a little bit pricey per unit.
Interesting. Thank you.
Oh, is that the time? Any more questions from anyone?
On a little bit of a, it's happening here. I think just as I was running from the weather outdoors, indoors. Yeah. Spoke about being an ex-forester.
I'm not an ex-forester. I'm a current forester. Not dead yet.
My apologies.
That's all right, Peter.
So, I've put in. So I've got. I think it's about 16 acres of woodland.
Yeah.
And it's ancient woodland here. A chunk of it is deciduous. Wetland. Then it goes to a very steep banky bit where I've got Scots pine and larch. Yeah. I've put in a plan to clear fell that.
Oh.
It's been passed by the Woodland Trust and yourselves, but I think I still need the woodland officer to come and sign it off.
Yeah, you need your felling license, yes.
Yes. So if that was cleared, and it's a few acres worth of trees that are cleared, I said that I'd like to try and turn it back into some more deciduous with hornbeam, oak, larch, not larch, sorry, and there's all sorts of trees going in. Would that come under, or would I be able to put that woodland into something like that from a higher tier?
Are you getting an area payment at the moment? You said you put it in a high tier. Oh no, you wouldn't have, would you?
So I don't get paid for anything here. No,
yeah. Okay. Yeah. So what I would do with your woodland, I would say you look at an enhancement. Okay, so you're going to move it from conifer to native woodland.
Deciduous, yes.
Yeah. So that sort of scheme would be eligible. And probably the best way to do is not through clear fell, but do a gradual change. If you did a clear fell, for example, you're obliged under the Forest Act to replace it with a woodland. In which case that obligation makes it hard to apply BNG. But what I'm doing with other woodlands in turning them from plantation and ancient woodlands to restoring ancient semi-natural is it's staged implementation over 20 years. So with your, say, Scots pine and your larch is maintain some canopy cover. So what you're doing is thinning all the time. And then you're underplanting and enriching with your native species. So you're maintaining a woodland cover and it's gradually sort of taking that change over. And that means you're not doing what is obliged under the Forestry Act, but you're actually sort of doing that as a voluntary action, which means then I think a biodiversity net gain payment could be applied. Does that make sense, Peter?
Yeah, no, I might actually try for it. I've only just paid for that to go in as well.
Yeah.
So I haven't started it yet, and I haven't got an actual felling license.
Yeah.
As okay, but not completely signed it off yet. So I might try the other way.
Yeah, if you want to send it over to me, and I'll have a look at it for you and see what we can do.
Okay. Thank you, Kay. Sorry.
Just to say, I've recorded it so that we can send it round to other group on the call.
Any dissenters? Okay.
Sorry, I wasn't able to hear that from Kay.
I was just saying I'm recording the meeting today. If it's okay with everyone that's here, I will then be able to share it with other people who weren't able to make it to the meeting for whatever reason today.
Oh,
if that's
fine.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Jolly good.
And like I say, we'll I'll PDF those slides and they can be shared as well.
That would be useful. Thank you.
Okay, no worries. So are there any more questions from anybody?
Well, I'd like, Jean speaking, thanks everyone who's put in the questions, because they're the ones that were coming to my mind as we went along. But thanks very much for a nice, straightforward presentation.
No, pleasure, Jean.
And I also quite like Don's anecdotes about his Highland cows.
Yeah.
Which I do have as well as Dexter.
Excellent, Pete. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. It's been excellent.
No, pleasure, Jill.
Okay. Nice to speak to, see you, hear you all. See you again soon.
Thank you, Kay.
Righto.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Okay.
Bye.